10:22 in the morning, March 6, 1944, 27,000 feet west of Berlin. Frost blooms on the canopy frame of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 as Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Meyer thumbs his radio switch. The oxygen mask tastes of rubber and fear. He hears the familiar, nervous braid of voices on the dayfighter net vectors from a ground controller, clipped acknowledgments from his swarm leader, a warning bark from someone already seeing contrails above, and then a flash of silver tears the cloud apart like cloth. 6 gun muzzles wink. The first burst is pure geometry. Meyer's wingman vanishes in a sheet of white vapor and fragments sparkling like salt. The radio hisses once, then nothing. A hard, suffocating nothing. Meyer rolls and dives and finds only silence where there should be words. He will remember the silence more than the tracers. The map stretches below in shades of winter brown and gray. Brandenburg Lakes, railway lines heading into the capital, a long ribbon of bombers sliding east. The bombers are the headline. The Mustangs are the subtext, the controller's last call. Rex oben, ho hey zwei acht, hangs unfinished as the P-51 seconds slide through the broken cumulus, turn their noses, and choose who dies first. The quiet that follows feels less like jamming and more like the air itself has decided to hold its breath. It is not the silence of safety, it is the silence of air superiority. By noon, the contrails knit a loose net across the sky. It looks calm from the ground. It is not. The Mustangs don't shout. They arrive, cut, and leave. A single sentence follows the opening image like a shadow. When the P-51 seconds learned to roam, the Luftwaffe learned to fear their silence. The camera pulls back out of the cockpit, over the bomber stream, across northern Germany to the Channel and the East Anglia airfields that sent this machine into motion. Definitions first, clean and simple. Strategic bombing. Heavy bombers, striking factories, rail yards, oil plants deep inside enemy territory. Escort radius. The lethal gap where friendly fighters cannot follow, a window of vulnerability measured not in miles but in men. In 1943, that window stretched over the heart of Germany. The bombers went alone and paid. At Schweinfurt, on October 14, 1943, the second raid on the ball-bearing works, losses fell like a calculation. Dozens of fortresses down out of a few hundred launched, thousands of airmen dead, captured, or missing in a single day. The lesson was simple and brutal. Deep raids without deep escort bled too fast to sustain. The Luftwaffe exploited the math. Ground radar, sector controllers, a network of fighter fields close to the target zones. Let the bombers come and build a belt of interceptors, then tear pieces out of the formation and vanish. Radios were the ligaments of this system. Controllers vectored, leaders called, wings answered. Talk held the swarm together. You could hear an interception grow like a storm in the headphones. Then the P-51B arrived with fuel tanks slung beneath its wings and a new set of verbs. It could cover the bombers and then leave them, sprint ahead and hunt. It could cruise at high throttle and still have the legs to get home. It could climb, dive, and still talk clearly over VHF. In January 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of 8th Air Force and issued a blunt reframe. Fighters would no longer hover near the bombers like nervous parents. They would be turned loose to destroy the enemy's air force in the air and on the ground. A change of doctrine sharper than any new airfoil. The why was hard arithmetic. Protect the bombers by killing the interceptors before they formed. The how was speed, range, and initiative packed into an airframe built to roam. The question that hangs over this cold March morning is not whether the P-51 could escort. It is why, when those Mustangs erupted from cloud, the radio nets that had once sounded like a marketplace suddenly fell still. By February 20th, 1944, big week, the test began. Day after day, streams of bombers hit aircraft factories while fighters, many of them new Mustangs, used the bomber route not as a leash, but as a ladder. Free chase, the pilots called it. They climbed above the stream, slid out to the sides, and watched for the arcs of climbing 109s and flew 190. When they pounced, the German formations often unraveled in seconds. Ground controllers still called. Leaders still tried to gather their Rotten and Schwarm, but the rhythm shifted. Orders, acknowledgements, A warning shouted over another warning, and then gaps, not the controlled silence of discipline. The stunned silence of men fighting for their lives, mouths open, hands too busy to press a switch. In ambush, words weigh more than air. The P-51's power was not a single statistic, but a chain of them. A Merlin engine built under license in the United States breathed high and cold through a tight air scoop. A laminar flow wing, thinner than it looked, cut drag at speed. With twin 108-gallon paper tanks added to fuel in the wings and fuselage, a Mustang could thread Berlin and still return to a wind-swept runway in East Anglia with reserve in the lines. 6.50 caliber guns, 200 rounds inboard, 270 outboard in the D model, slightly different in the B and C, through a river of metal that chewed through tailplanes and coolant lines. A radio set that held its signal clean above the bomber chatter meant formation leaders did not have to shout to be heard. The airplane carried more than bullets. It carried options. The Luftwaffe's options thinned with each month. Flight schools cut training hours from pre-war standards down to bare survival as fuel and time both vanished. Mid-1943 classes had learned aerobatics with hundreds of hours in the log. By mid-1944, some students arrived at the front without even a full set of formation flights. The controllers still tried to knit them into a killing circle, but a circle frays when you cut its nodes. Kill the Schwarmführer, and the net of voices goes slack. Kill two leaders, and the net becomes a handful of voices too scattered to trust. Watch March 6th unfold. The first major daylight strike on Berlin. The meteorology reports push the stream high to stay above the broken cumulus. The bomber crews make their checks. The Luftwaffe rises a constellation of Gruppe climbing in spear points, JG-11 from the northwest, JG-300 from the south, others forming near the havens of cloud. A 357th Fighter Group element, the Yoxford Boys, has already learned what cloud does to nerves. It hides, it deceives. It lets you stack a surprise inside a surprise. They drop through ragged holes into the slipstream of the German climb, behind and slightly above. No words. A trim pump hums. A gloved hand tightens on the stick. Silver flashes in a swirl of cloud scrap. The first 109 rolls dives and explodes. Break! Break! A German voice barks on the net, then cuts off as if the cord has been severed. For a heartbeat, there is only wind in the headsets and the cough of a Merlin when the mixture leans too hard. The camera finds Mayer again, eyes searching, hearing only the breath of his own regulator. He keys his mic and says nothing. When systems collide, they do not merely trade losses. They rewrite each other's habits. The P-51 carried a habit of initiative. Bounce, separate, climb, and bounce again. American flight leaders drilled into their men the idea that altitude was a bank account. Spend it on the first pass, deposit it again by climbing back into the Sunday. German habits, discipline, tight formation, reliance on controller vectors had once maximized their small numbers against bombers. Against swarms of roving escorts, those habits hardened into vulnerabilities. If you cannot speak, you cannot vector. If you cannot gather, you cannot mass. A controller's voice has reach, but no armor. Anecdote telescopes into pattern by the second week of March. Pilots of the 4th Fighter Group tell of finding entire German takeoff patterns forming at once and descending on them like a hawk on pigeons. The 352nd, the blue-nosed P, 51 seconds from Bodny, begin to watch flak bursts as clues, then slide through cloud to appear behind climbing fighters who believe themselves still unseen. The Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd, operating further south and east, develop a reputation for never abandoning their bombers, which in turn forces many German units to accept an escorted fight they would rather avoid. Names cross the logbooks: Preddy, Anderson, Jaeger, Goodson, men whose individual arcs will later be carved into memory. But the real story is not the silhouette of a single ace. It is the arithmetic of many ordinary pilots adopting a doctrine that multiplies small surprises into large results. Listen to the numbers argue with each other. In late 1943, unescorted raids into central Germany could see loss rates measured in multiple % per mission, enough to erase a group's combat strength in a few weeks. By late spring 1944, with Mustangs in force and doctrine unleashed, typical loss rates on many deep raids were cut roughly in half then lower still as the Luftwaffe's day fighter arm bled out its experience. Not uniform. Not every day bad weather and bad luck still had votes, but the trend line speaks. An Air Force learns faster when it has fuel for mistakes and time to try again. The United States had both. Germany, increasingly, had neither. The Luftwaffe's radio silence had more than one cause. First was shock. An ambushed pilot does not announce his ambush. He pulls, he rolls, he lives, or he dies. Second was saturation. Fighter nets that had once carried clear instructions now burst with overlapping warnings the moment Mustangs appeared above and behind. In the chaos of the first minute, transmissions collided and cancelled. The net sounded like a crowd underwater until it sounded like nothing at all. Third was attrition among leaders. A swarm without its leader is a swarm without a hive. When the man with the habit of decision goes out in a hiss of coolant, those who remain inherit his channel but not his certainty. Words shorten. Calls dry up. The ground controller hears quiet and imagines order. Above, the quiet is merely one more thing to fear. Cloud runs like a motif through this case. Winter cumulus with sun glittering off its tops is not weather, it is terrain. The P-51's engine held power high enough to loiter above, then fall into a fight and climb back into the bright where nobody looks because nobody can stand to. The best ambush in the sky is the one that looks like sunlight. When a Mustang bursts from a slice of cloud at 6 o'clock high, its target has less than 2 seconds to understand. 2 seconds is half a sentence. Achtung! And then the rest of the word is heat, air, aluminum. If you want to measure fear, do not count screams. Count silences. By February's end, Big Week had overstretched the Luftwaffe's roster of men who could teach. In March and April, Doolittle's order to strike airfields on the return leg, once a tactical afterthought, becomes a policy with strategic teeth. Atchison, Leiston, Debden, Bodney. The names of English bases slide by as fuel trucks roll and armorers feed belts into wings. On the continent, Wesel, Gütersloh, Berg, Achmer, the names of German fields, appear in group after-action reports with the same chilling phrase, targets of opportunity. A day fighter's life used to be the climb, the fight, the handshake with ground crew after. Now the danger arrives in the pattern, in the flare, in the moment of softness when wheels leave Earth or find it again. Radio discipline in that moment is an act of will. You want to scream, Bowden, Bowden, to warn the others. But even if you do, it will be one word, and then the switch goes cold. Pull in a micro scene. A German controller in a bunker near Stade, headphones pressed hard, pencils worn to nubs, watches the radar scope sweep, and speaks into his microphone with a tone that imitates calm. Turn 90 right. Climb 2000. Schnell. He expects replies like beads on a string. Instead, he hears the same two voices, both too loud, undercut by breath, giving partial bearings that contradict. He turns his chair. The room smells of dust, hot cables, and stale coffee. When he keys again, he curses himself because the curse is what the fighters will remember. He is trained to be a metronome, but metronomes do not dodge Mustangs. Now follow a Mustang down through a gap to the deck, belly tanks long gone, guns clean and hot. The pilot slides along a railway at treetop height and spots a grass field crowded with aircraft. Flak bursts behind him like black flowers that do not bloom quite where he is. He presses the mic and says, "Tally, tally, keep it high." And then he stops talking because the runway is ahead and the best thing he can give his element is timing. His tracers walk through a taxiing 190. The canopy pops and a dark shape tumbles once. He is over the field for 8 seconds. 8 seconds is 4 sentences in a debrief and no sentences in a fight. He banks left, climbs as much as he dares, sees the flak switch from late to early, and laughs once inside his mask because laughter sometimes preserves oxygen better than prayer. Numbers again, but larger now. If the P-51 delivered range and speed and a radio as clear as an open room, its larger gift was to translate American industrial scale into a cadence that erased German tactical ritual. A squadron takes off every 2 minutes. A group crosses the coast on the minute. A wing scatters into a cloud deck and arrives above a target with enough fuel to make 3 choices instead of 1. Multiply that by 5 air forces and 8 fighter groups, and the arithmetic stops feeling like arithmetic and starts feeling like weather inevitable, impersonal, everywhere at once. The Luftwaffe once made weather of its own. In 1940 and 1941, it could flood a sky with fighters in the time it took a controller to light a cigarette. By early 1944, the plane count on paper still looked hard. But the flow in the pipes, the fuel, the training, the spare parts, the time had slowed. The Mustangs did not merely meet German fighters in the air. They met them at the joints of their system and broke the habit of talking the fight into being. The war on radios is not only jamming, it is tempo. Operate at a tempo higher than your adversary's human communications bandwidth, and you jam him with events. On a good day, the German system could compress observation, decision, and action into a minute. The P-51 made the critical phase of an interception the merge shorter than that minute and repeated it before the net had regained breath. The result sounds like a skipped record. Call, cut. Call, cut. After enough cuts, the rest of the song never plays. Another morning, another front. April 11th, 1944, near Oschersleben, fighter factories behind their smokestacks, cloud at 6,000, sun above. A swarm from JG-1 climbs through milky light, while a free chase flight from the 355th rolls in from 2 o'clock. The German leader sees them late, calls, umdrehen, and peels. His wingman extracts half a roll and too much rudder. A flash of yellow nose fills his world. The radio crackles once with a fragment of a name, his leader's name. Then it goes to carrier and stays there, a blank channel that feels like a tunnel with no end. He flies the rest of the fight with one hand on the throttle and the other around that silence like a wound. There is a human truth under the hardware. Confidence has a frequency, and so does fear. You can hear confidence in the loose chatter of an experienced flight coasting toward a fight it expects to control. You can hear fear in vector calls tightening into clipped commands. In late 1943, German day fighters often sounded confident within their defensive belt. In early 1944, that sound changed. On the worst days, they sounded like a man pulling wire with his teeth. Not because they were cowards, many were extraordinarily brave, but because the tempo above them had shifted, and the place where radios once lived, between intention and action, had narrowed to a slit. Close the slit further, and words go first. By the time spring grades into summer, the lesson turns systemic. The P-51 turns out to be a scalpel with a hammer's reach. Factory raids now end with strafing runs on airfields. Deep escort missions of 6 hours once meant a grim climb home for exhausted crews. Now they often end with Mustang elements still looking for work as they cross the coast. The Luftwaffe tries to adapt dispersal of aircraft on fields, camouflage, more flak, surprise massing under cloud and climbing straight into the bomber stream, but adaptation burns fuel, pilots, and commanders, and nothing replenishes faster than the Americans now can. By June, over Normandy, the radio silence spreads from dogfights to entire days. German pilots speak little because the few who speak are the few who can still fly, and they are too busy surviving to narrate. And yet, inside this story, larger gears click. Oil. The raids on synthetic fuel and refineries begin to bite by late spring. A fighter without fuel is an art piece. A fighter pilot without fuel is a ghost with paperwork. Training programs compress further. Combat tours stretch. Radios carry fewer voices, because there are fewer voices left to carry. When the Mustangs appear above a sector, the sector often simply stops. Controllers go through the motions. They draw lines on maps. The maps look like hope. Hope does not transmit over very high frequency. Cut back to our opening day, and to Mayer, who has spent the last minute diving through 3 layers of cloud, counting to 6 between layers to keep enough separation from whatever is behind him. He levels at 10,000 feet over a lake that looks like a blade and finds his hands steady again. He presses the transmit switch and says, "Mayer, alive!" Because sometimes the only report worth giving is that you can still give it. No one responds. He thinks the radio is broken. He shakes the cord and hears it settle in the wind. He thinks of the man in the other cockpit, the Mustang pilot who appeared like thunder inside cotton and left just as fast. He wonders if that man is speaking, now, to a calm voice far away who says, "Turn left, climb, hunt." Mayer breathes out. The breath fogs his glass and clears. Above him, the contrails weave. What happened next made the pattern obvious. The silence did not mean emptiness. It meant compression. Compress a system past its talking speed, and it stops sounding like a system at all. If this was true locally radio nets going quiet, the instant Mustangs appeared from cloud, then it followed, system-wide. A doctrine that turned escort fighters into predators would not only reduce bomber losses, it would hollow out the communications lattice that once let the Luftwaffe scale its courage. Each ambush cut a voice. Each cut voice left a gap. Each gap multiplied the next ambush. By the end of March, the numbers told a different story than they had in October. The bomber stream still lost aircraft. Men still did not come home, but the arc bent. Deeper targets struck with less blood than before, enemy formations broken earlier in their climb, leaders lost first and often. Mission reports show the new pattern in their unpoetic prose. Enemy E divided by a enemy aircraft. Attacked from 2 o'clock high, bounced, many seen to spin, radio calls intermittent. Intermittent, that is how fear prints itself in ink. There is a moment in every fight when the fight has already been decided, even if the men inside it have not yet learned the decision. On March 6th, that moment arrived when the Mustang flights, loosed from caretaker duty, crossed above the bomber stream, and went hunting. On maps, this looks like a shallow arc. In memory, it sounds like the wind in a headset and the absence of words. The quiet that follows an ambush is not peace. It is the pause between a system's old assumptions and its new reality. The turning point hides in plain sound. Not a new engine note, not a flash of tracer, but the absence of speech at the moment when speech once controlled everything. The reveal is simple and devastating. The Mustangs did not merely shoot down airplanes. They collapsed a communications rhythm. A system that lived by voice died when the fight moved faster than words. Watch the inversion play out in a single merge. March 6th, 1944 again, over Berlin's western approaches, sun high, cloud thin as gauze. A German schwarm lifts through 24,000 feet. The leader calls headings with the crisp cadence of habit. 200 steigen. His wingmen echo. Their ground controller, 40 miles away and 5 seconds behind, feeds bearings from a radar scope that sweeps like a slow heartbeat. Then 4 P-51Bs, climbing faster than intuition, arrive 10 seconds early and 20 degrees unexpected. The leader sees a glint where there should be sky and keys his mic for a warning. Achtung! He never finishes. A white streak crosses, a rudder snaps, a canopy flashes open, and the frequency goes to carrier. The remaining 3 pilots are still speaking when their words lose listeners. In the span of a single breath, the Luftwaffe's elegant choreography vector, sight, close, volley, becomes a skirmish of individuals. The net was the formation. Cut the net, and the formation ceases to exist. Before, in October 1943, the pattern was speak then kill. Controllers marshaled fighters into timed ladders, leaders barked, formations bit into unescorted bombers from nose and tail and beam. After, in March 1944, the pattern became kill then speak. The Mustangs forced decisions first, sentences second. They made the conversation arrive late. Pilots felt it as vertigo. In diaries and debriefs, you can sense the moment the tempo bent. They came from the sun, no call. Leader gone. Fragments, not plans. The physics had not changed. The philosophy had. Doolittle's order, destroy the German Air Force, turned escorts into predators and radio discipline into a luxury. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, shrank below the bandwidth of human instruction. When that loop compresses, a shouted warning becomes an epitaph. There is a cruel economy to this. The Luftwaffe's strength had always been concentration. Gather a critical mass at the right place and time, and trade 4 minutes of fury for a dozen heavy bombers. But concentration requires coordination, and coordination requires talk. The Mustang's greatest weapon was not its 50s. It was the way its speed and range let American units choose the whens and wheres that made German words obsolete on arrival. A single scene can stand for the larger reveal. Somewhere over Saxony that spring, a flight from Jägerschwader 300 climbs into bright air, turns to intercept the Contrail River, and braces for the old ritual. The leader's voice is steady. On Flug, zusammenbleiben. Stay together. Then the ritual dissolves. A pair of P-51 seconds slices down from 10 o'clock high, unseen because they are exactly where the sun refuses to let the eye linger. The first German breaks too late. The second breaks too soon. The third never gets a verb onto the air. The fourth survives, dives, runs, swallows the taste of oxygen and panic, and realizes halfway home that he has not heard another friendly voice for 2 minutes. Not fear's whimper, not bravado's bark. Only wind and the faint hiss of a set waiting for a speaker. When he lands, the flak gunners ask how the fight went. He answers with a hand across the neck. A soldier's sign for silence. That means death. The before and after cut sharper when you place 2 days side by side. October 14th, 1943. Schweinfurt, where bombers go deep without deep escort and pay an entire cruise. March 6th, 1944. Berlin, where bombers go deeper with P-51 seconds roaming, and the great German day fighter belt fights in fragments. The numbers are not the same. The radios are not the same. The sky is not the same. It looks like the old war from the ground. It is not. Single-line thesis. The P-51 didn't just escort bombers, it throttled the Luftwaffe's ability to think out loud. By April 1944, the consequences stack, immediate and cumulative. Leader losses mount. Veteran instructors rotate to combat and vanish. Trainees arrive thin on hours, their hands competent but their ears unseasoned. You can teach gunnery on the ground. You cannot teach how a frequency feels in the first minute of an ambush without flying through that minute and surviving it. Many do not. Fuel drains the system from the other end. The oil campaign begins to bite in late spring. Synthetic plants at Lona, Berlin, Politz. Brooks names that mean chemistry to civilians and fuel to pilots start to smoke when they should be distilling. Flight hours shrink again. Controllers become miserly with vector calls because they know every scramble burns gallons the Reich can no longer spare. But war does not accept thrift. The Mustangs are still there, high, fast, early. They cut into the takeoff pattern. They comb the perimeters of fields. They walk tracer down taxiways and brick revetments spun with camouflage net. The German answer is dispersal and deception. Aircraft under trees, decoys on sod, fresh paint that turns a canopy into a shadow. The American answer is time and numbers and doctrine. Look longer, come back tomorrow, hit airfields on the way home, and if cloud hides the target, wait over the hole until fear forces a climb. The Tuskegee Airmen, flying red-tailed P-51 seconds with the 15th Air Force out of Italy, compress a different loop on a different front. Their standing order to hold tight to the heavies an ethic as much as a tactic forces German fighters into frontal or tail attacks under the guns of prepared escorts. On March 24, 1945, Captain Roscoe Brown leads an element that finds a jet rising too soon into a sky choked with transports and escorts. He closes, his wings steady, the jet's advantage negated in the clutter of speed and surprise. Now, he says into his mask, not for drama, but because a word still matters if you own the timing of it. The Me-262 falls off to the right, trailing a long, clean flame. In the debrief, he will describe the angles and ranges. The important detail is simpler. It was the Allied side that decided when to speak. Hermann Goering would later admit the sick knowledge that crept in with a new silhouette. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. He did not mean that one airplane changed the fate of empires by itself. He meant that a set of American choices, engine, wing, tankage, radio, and a doctrine that treated escort as a prelude to a hunt had reached the German capital with fuel to spare, and nothing in front of it that could organize a defense fast enough to matter. The sentence contains an empire's reheated fear. If the enemy can choose the fight over your heartland and make you fight it dumb and late, your future has already been negotiated without you. Stretch the frame to Normandy, June 1944. Allied fighters do not merely patrol, they police. The Luftwaffe's day fighter strength, bled by Big Week and March and April, now faces an invasion front that multiplies targets, bridges, columns. rail yards, airfields. A handful of 109s managed to appear over the beaches on June 6th. Most do not because takeoff invites death. A German pilot who tries anyway keeps his calls to a minimum, not because he prefers stoicism, but because speech invites triangulation by men who have turned the sky into a graph. He makes it to the coast, sees an ocean armored with ships, hears an English voice crackle friendly to someone else, then hears the end of his own war arrive behind him with 6 gun flashes and a single clinical sentence. Splash one bandit. He never hears a second sentence. In the Ardennes, December 1944, the Luftwaffe salvages one last gamble. Bodenplatte, New Year's Day, 1945. A low-level strike against Allied airfields meant to smash parked aircraft and buy breathing room for a stalled offensive. The plan demands silence, radio and otherwise. Surprise is the weapon. But surprise cuts both ways when discipline meets chaos at treetop height. Some German units navigate clean and deadly. Others clip trees, lose formation integrity, or blunder into British and American flak they might have avoided with a call that doctrine forbids. The strikes burn hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground and cost the attackers irreplaceable pilots. In the days that follow, Mustang units find the returning survivors strung out and late. They harvest. The radio paradox completes itself. The one time the Luftwaffe chooses silence as a tactic, the silence outlasts the morning because there are fewer men to speak after noon. By the first months of 1945, the pattern is total. The 8th and 15th Air Forces cross into the Reich with bomber losses that, while never trivial, look survivable on a planner's chart. Escort groups build kill claims and then stop counting because the objective was never the scoreboard. It was absence empty air where a dense belt of interceptors used to be. Absence you can measure by how long a frequency stays clear. Absence that means bombing accuracy measured in target photographs rather than obituaries. America's industrial cadence underwrites the air cadence. Training pipelines fatten instead of starve. Replacement aircraft arrive in crates instead of promises. Maintenance standards rise with experience rather than fall with fatigue. A 357th Fighter Group crew chief learns the squeak of a particular Merlin bearing and changes it before it fails because he has the part and the time. The corresponding German mechanic listens to a different bearing, sing itself to death, and has only calendar days to trade for the hours he lacks. In that asymmetry, radios tell another story. The American net carries chatter because it can, because fuel and altitude and numbers grant the luxury of talk that does not risk survival. The German net, when it speaks at all, compresses into directives and fragments because every word costs attention and attention is scarce. And yet, reduce this to only numbers and you lose the faces. Men sat in these cockpits. Men turned these dials, felt these straps bite, heard these headsets hiss. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Meyer, who dove through 3 layers of cloud and said, "alive," into a void, flies again a week later, then again, then not again after April because he is in a hospital bed with bandages folded like uniforms. He does not know who fired the burst that broke his world that day over the Havel. He knows the quiet his friend left behind on the net. On the other side, a pilot from the 352nd Fighter Group named George, blue nose out front, comes back from a mission with cordite residue on his gloves and the habit of not speaking about one of the passes because words put weight where speed had kept things light. He cleans his goggles himself, a pointless act when there are men paid to do it because ritual is how you re-enter a room where talk sounds human again. After the guns cool, the world remembers in shorthand. Thunderbolt for durability, Spitfire for grace, Mustang for range, but this story is not about adjectives. It is about a system of radios that once orchestrated interception and the airplane doctrine coalition that made those radios late everywhere at once. The silence is not poetry. It is logistics made audible. For the men who survived, the change wrote itself into muscle. An American pilot who had learned to fly tight on a bomber's wingtip now learned to hunt 30 miles ahead, scan for a speck at 2 o'clock, count the beats between sun and cloud, and make choices inside those beats. A German pilot trained to trust the controller more than his hunch now lived or died by hunch alone. By summer 1944, that hunch often told him to stay down because down was where voices were. Up was where silence waited. In the aftermath, When factories are still, and fields are mottled with steel and wood, and the empty shells of barrels, memories settle into two kinds. The days when the net was alive with talk, and the days when talk didn't matter because the Mustangs were already there. The former feel like games of chess played with knives. The latter feel like weather warnings that arrive after the flood recedes. The consequences run forward beyond the last dogfight. Post-war air forces study the lesson and write it into their bones. Communications are a weapon until they become a bottleneck, win by pushing decisions below the threshold where words can keep up. Jet-age designers nod towards speed and altitude and sensors. Tacticians underline tempo. Radios improve. Encryption tightens. Data links replace voices in some places. Yet the core remains. If you can make the enemy's first sentence arrive after your second action, you are already winning. Return to the opening image. 10:22 in the morning, March 6th, 1944. Frost still blooms on a canopy frame. A pilot's gloved thumb still hesitates over a switch because habit and fear are the same muscle when the sky tears and something silver writes a diagonal across your life. But now invert it. We are in a ready room in East Anglia hours later. The stove ticks. The map smells of thumbtacks and chalk. A young man rubs the bridge of his nose and listens to his own heartbeat. He remembers a burst and a shape and the way the radio went quiet as if someone had folded sound in half. He does not grin or boast. He says softly, "They never called," and only later will he understand that this is not bravado. It is diagnosis. Not victory through a superplane alone, but victory through range married to doctrine, doctrine married to tempo, tempo faster than talk. Not by shouting louder, but by making the other side silent sooner. The radio stays on the table between them, mute, heavy, honest. It is the weight of what changed, and the echo of how.